November 10th, 1942. 0200 hours. The port city of Oran, Algeria. 12,000 American soldiers are fighting through the dark streets of North Africa for the first time in World War II. The guns are loud. The casualties are climbing. Commanders at every level are screaming into radio handsets, demanding orders, demanding guidance, demanding someone to tell them what to do next. They needed their commanding general. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the man Dwight Eisenhower personally selected to lead Second Corps, the man George Marshall called one of the finest officers in the United States Army, was nowhere near the battle. He was asleep, not wounded, not incapacitated, not cut off from communications. Asleep, in his quarters, while American boys bled in the streets 100 miles away. And yet, that single act of negligence was not what got him fired. What got him fired was a pattern. A weeks-long collapse of leadership so complete, so embarrassing, so destructive to the men under his command, that Eisenhower had no choice but to relieve him of command in the middle of an active campaign. The fallout from that decision would reshape how the United States Army understood battlefield leadership forever. This is the story of Lloyd Fredendall, the Tunisia disaster, and the moment Dwight Eisenhower learned that rank and reputation are not the same thing as command. To understand why Fredendall's failure mattered so much, you first need to understand what the United States Army looked like in 1942. It was, by any honest measure, a military in the middle of construction. In 1939, the entire United States Army had fewer than 175,000 soldiers on active duty. By comparison, Germany had over 3 million men under arms that same year. France had 5 million. The Soviet Union had over 1.5 million. America was, in practical terms, starting from nothing. By the time Operation Torch launched on November 8, 1942, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, the Army had expanded to over 5 million men. But expansion in numbers does not equal expansion in experience. Most of those 5 million had never seen combat. Second Corps, the formation Fredendall commanded, represented the core of American ground strength in the theater. It comprised roughly 39,000 soldiers organized across 4 divisions. The 1st Armored Division carried the majority of the armor, 462 tanks, primarily the M3 Lee and the newer M4 Sherman. The 1st Infantry Division and the 34th Infantry Division provided the ground-holding muscle. The 1st Ranger Battalion provided the cutting edge for high-risk assault missions. On paper, it was a powerful force, but paper and battlefield are 2 different countries. The M3 Lee tank, which equipped most of the 1st Armored's battalions at that point in the war, weighed 27 tons and carried a 75mm gun mounted in a side sponson, meaning the tank had to physically turn its entire hull to engage most targets. Its armor topped out at 57mm on the front. Against the German Panzer IV, with its long-barreled 75mm gun, and certainly against the Panzer VI Tiger, which carried a devastating 88mm cannon and frontal armor over 100mm thick, the Lee was dangerously outmatched. American crews knew this. What they did not yet know was how to compensate for it through tactics, coordination, and disciplined leadership. That gap between equipment limitations and tactical skill was exactly what a commander like Fredendall was supposed to close. He did not close it. The Allied coalition fighting in North Africa held structural advantages that should have been decisive. By late 1942, the Allied supply chain across the Atlantic was, despite catastrophic losses to German U-boats, delivering roughly 8 million tons of cargo per month to Britain alone. Repair facilities, replacement parts, ammunition, food, medical supplies. The industrial weight of the United States, producing 1 tank every 4 minutes by peak wartime output, sat behind every American unit in the field. Germany had no equivalent backstop. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps and the broader Army Group Africa, reinforced by Italian formations, were operating at the absolute end of a supply line that crossed the Mediterranean under constant threat from Allied air and naval power. In November 1942 alone, Allied forces sank or disrupted over 40% of the Axis supply tonnage bound for Tunisia. Rommel himself wrote in his diary during this period, quote, "Our strength is ebbing away." The Allies, in other words, could afford mistakes. Germany could not. But that strategic cushion created a dangerous illusion inside some American headquarters. The idea that material superiority made sound tactical leadership optional. Fredendall operated under precisely that illusion. While his soldiers struggled through unfamiliar terrain and faced veteran German and Italian formations, Fredendall built his command post. Not near the front, not in a position to observe and react. He chose a ravine near the town of Tebessa, Algeria, 70 miles from the front line. He then ordered his combat engineers, men who should have been building defensive positions for frontline units, to spend 2 weeks blasting a tunnel system into the rock face. The tunnel complex required over 150 engineering troops working around the clock to complete. Those engineering hours came directly out of the defensive preparations of the units that would eventually be slaughtered at Kasserine Pass. The man who shaped American military leadership doctrine in that era was not Fredendall. It was General Leslie J. McNair, the commanding general of Army Ground Forces, who oversaw the training and preparation of every American ground unit that entered combat in World War II. McNair's doctrine was direct. Commanders lead from the front. Initiative flows downward. Junior leaders act without waiting for permission. Flexibility trumps rigidity. The United States Army's Field Service Regulations, specifically FM 100-5, published in 1941, made this philosophy explicit. Commanders were expected to position themselves where they could influence the battle in real time. They were expected to delegate authority to subordinates and trust those subordinates to execute. This was, philosophically, an American adaptation of the German concept of Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, where commanders provide the intent and subordinates find the method. McNair embedded this into training through the Louisiana Maneuvers of 1941, the largest peacetime military exercises in American history, involving over 400,000 troops. Generals who showed timidity, who kept headquarters too far from the action, who micromanaged subordinates, were graded poorly. Several were relieved even during exercises. Fredendall performed well enough in those exercises to earn his promotion and Eisenhower's confidence. But performance in exercises, with referees and safety nets, is a different test than performance under fire. Fredendall's actual command philosophy, when exposed to genuine combat, revealed itself to be the opposite of McNair's doctrine. He distrusted his subordinate commanders. He issued orders in a bizarre personal code that often confused the officers who received them. He communicated by phone from his underground command post rather than visiting the front. And he openly disparaged the officers under his command in messages to Eisenhower. Messages that Eisenhower, to his later regret, did not immediately act upon. One of the men Fredendall most consistently undermined was Brigadier General Raymond McQuillan, the commander of Combat Command A of the 1st Armored Division. Fredendall's interference in McQuillan's operations, issuing contradictory orders, bypassing the chain of command, and positioning units in ways that McQuillan's staff considered tactically incoherent, directly contributed to the conditions that produced disaster. The disaster came at Kasserine Pass, February 14, 1943, Valentine's Day. Rommel and Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim launched a coordinated assault through the western dorsal mountain range in Tunisia. The operation was designed to crush American forces before they could gain experience and cohesion, potentially turning the entire North African campaign. They nearly succeeded. Over 4 days of fighting, from February 14th to February 22nd, 1943, German and Italian forces tore through American positions at Sidi Bou Zid and then exploded through Kasserine Pass. The 1st Armored Division lost over 100 tanks in 2 days. Approximately 6,500 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire battalions disintegrated under the pressure. The American retreat at points became a rout. German commander Fritz Bayerlein, Rommel's chief of staff, later wrote that the American performance at Kasserine confirmed German assumptions that American troops were not yet ready for serious combat. He was partly right. But the failure was not primarily a failure of American soldiers. It was a failure of American command. Fredendall's dispositions had scattered his forces across a 40-mile front in a way that prevented mutual support. His orders had placed individual battalions in exposed positions without armor protection. His command post, 70 miles to the rear, carved into rock, meant he could not see what was happening and could not react in time when it did. When the breakthrough came, there was no one at the top who could grab the situation and impose order on it. Eisenhower flew to the front on February 19th. What he saw disturbed him profoundly. He later wrote in his memoir, quote, "I was not satisfied with the Alexander report on Fredendall. Something was wrong." The shift came from a man named General Harold Alexander, the British commander Eisenhower had just appointed to run ground operations for the entire theater as commander of 18th Army Group. Alexander visited the front, assessed the situation, and sent Eisenhower a blunt assessment. American leadership at the Corps level was not functioning. Eisenhower also received reports from his aide, Major General Omar Bradley, whom he had sent to 2nd Corps as an observer. Bradley's report was clinical and damning. Fredendall had lost the confidence of his subordinate commanders. His orders were confusing. His presence at the front was essentially non-existent. The first concrete proof that the adaptation was coming came on March 6, 1943. Eisenhower relieved Fredendall of command. He replaced him with Major General George S. Patton. Patton arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters the following morning. He walked through the command post, took one look at the officers around him, and announced that the situation was going to change immediately. He set a dress code. He imposed discipline. He moved the headquarters forward. He visited the frontline units personally, every single day. Within 72 hours, the mood inside 2nd Corps had shifted in a way that men who were there would describe for the rest of their lives. Patton was not universally admired. He was harsh, profane, and frequently brutal in his treatment of subordinates. But he was present, and presence in combat command is not optional. Battle of El Guettar, March 23, 1943. 3 weeks after Patton took command, 2nd Corps attacked at El Guettar in central Tunisia. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, pushed through Gafsa and seized the key road junction that opened the path toward the coast. The attack involved approximately 22,000 American soldiers and 200 tanks. The Germans responded with a counterattack by the 10th Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored formations in the German military, equipped with Panzer IV tanks and accompanied by infantry. The Americans held. More than that, they destroyed 53 German tanks in a single day of fighting, using a coordinated combination of tank destroyer battalions, artillery, and infantry anti-tank weapons firing from prepared positions. It was the first clear American tactical victory against German armor in the war. From the German perspective, the performance shocked them. General Heinz Ziegler, who commanded Axis forces in the sector, reported to Army Group Africa that the American infantry had fought with unexpected tenacity and that their artillery coordination had been markedly improved. He was right. The artillery had not changed. The equipment had not changed. The training had not fundamentally changed. What had changed was the command. Fall of Bizerte, May 7, 1943. By the first week of May 1943, the Axis position in Tunisia had become untenable. Second Corps, now commanded by Omar Bradley after Patton moved to plan the Sicily invasion, drove north toward the port city of Bizerte, with the 9th Infantry Division and 1st Armored Division leading the assault. On May 7, 1943, just 60 days after Patton had taken command of a broken corps, American forces entered Bizerte. The same day, British forces entered Tunis. The Axis armies in North Africa had nowhere to retreat. The sea behind them was controlled by the Royal Navy. The air above them was controlled by the Allied air forces. The land in front of them was controlled by Allied ground forces on 3 sides. Over 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in the following week. It was the largest single surrender of Axis forces in the war to that point. Churchill called it the end of the beginning. The numbers told the real story. From the disaster at Kasserine Pass in February to the fall of Bizerte in May, 78 days, Second Corps had transformed from a formation that broke under pressure into one that helped seal the fate of an entire Axis army group. The Pursuit, April 22nd to May 13th, 1943. During the final phase of the Tunisian campaign, Second Corps executed a series of coordinated attacks across the northern sector that forced the Germans to thin their already exhausted defensive lines. The 34th Infantry Division, which had been humiliated at Kasserine, fought its way through the heavily defended hill complex near Hill 609, a position that had stopped previous attacks cold. They took it after 6 days of brutal close-quarters fighting that cost them over 1,000 casualties. General Alexander, who had initially dismissed American troops as tactically inferior to British forces, sent a report to London that contained a remarkable reversal. He wrote that the 34th Division's performance had been, quote, as good as anything I have seen. The same soldiers who had broken in February were the ones taking Hill 609 in April. The difference was not the soldiers. The victory in Tunisia was real. But the cost demands to be stated plainly. American forces in the Tunisian campaign suffered approximately 18,000 total casualties, 2,500 killed, 8,900 wounded, and approximately 6,300 missing or captured. A significant portion of those casualties, particularly those taken at Kasserine, were directly attributable to poor command decisions rather than enemy superiority. The institutional flaw that produced Fredendall was not an accident. The United States Army's promotion and selection system in the pre-war period rewarded administrative competence, political reliability, and performance in peacetime exercises. It had limited ability to test actual combat leadership because America had not fought a major land war since 1918. Fredendall had served competently for decades. He had impressed the right people. He had said the right things in the right rooms. But none of that revealed what he would do at 2 a.m. when the battle was going wrong, and the decisions had to be made. Omar Bradley, reflecting on this later in his memoir, wrote with characteristic bluntness, "We had simply never had a way to find out who the real commanders were until we put them in front of the enemy." That is an honest accounting, and it represents a systemic cost, paid in lives, that the United States Army had to absorb before it could build the command culture that eventually won the war. Fredendall himself was not court-martialed. He was sent back to the United States, promoted to lieutenant general, and given command of a training army. He spent the rest of the war teaching. The Army could not publicly humiliate a senior officer without undermining confidence in the officer corps. So his failure was managed, not punished. That, too, is part of the honest record. The Axis forces in Tunisia, German and Italian alike, were not defeated because they were inferior soldiers. By 1943, the Afrika Korps contained some of the most experienced combat veterans on Earth. Men who had fought across the deserts of Libya and Egypt, who had developed a sophisticated integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power that other armies spent years trying to replicate. They could win battles. They did win battles. They broke American units, outmaneuvered British formations, and repeatedly frustrated Allied plans throughout the campaign. But they could not defeat the system behind the American army. Every tank they destroyed was replaced. Every ammunition dump they captured was restocked. Every unit they broke was rebuilt. The logistical depth of the Allied coalition, anchored in American industrial production and British maritime power, made attrition a game the Axis could not win. Rommel understood this. He wrote to his wife in February 1943, quote, "The battle is lost before it is decided." He was describing a structural reality, not a tactical one. The deeper lesson of Fredendall's relief is this: material strength does not compensate for leadership failure. It only delays the consequences. Eisenhower's willingness to fire a general he personally selected in the middle of a campaign based on performance rather than loyalty was itself a demonstration of institutional character. That willingness to hold commanders accountable, regardless of rank or reputation, was the philosophy that separated the American command culture from its enemies, and ultimately, from many of its allies. The war in North Africa reflected something true about the nation fighting it. America entered that war with enormous material power and insufficient experience. It absorbed the lessons of failure at a cost it should not have had to pay. And then it adapted, reorganized, and applied those lessons with a ruthlessness that, over the following 2 years, proved decisive. Generals get the history books, but the story of Kasserine Pass and the Tunisian Campaign belongs to men whose names most people will never read. Private First Class James Everett Dobbins of the 34th Infantry Division, a farm boy from Iowa who had never been outside the United States before shipping out to North Africa. He was 20 years old at Kasserine. He survived. Corporal Anthony Russo of the 1st Armored Division, from a working-class neighborhood in Philadelphia, who was in one of the tank crews that held at Guettar in March. He was 22 years old. He did not survive. Sergeant Willie Holloway, one of thousands of Black American soldiers who served in support roles, quartermaster, engineering, transportation, whose contributions to keeping the supply lines open made every tactical victory possible, and who came home to a country that celebrated the victory while refusing them the full rights of the citizens they had fought to defend. These were the men behind the headlines, behind the command decisions, behind the maps and the radio traffic, and the endless back and forth between generals who argued over credit and responsibility. By the 1990s, veterans of the North African Campaign were among the oldest surviving American combat veterans of World War II. Today, those who served in Tunisia in 1942 and 1943 are gone. The last of them have passed, which means the only people who can carry what they did are the ones who choose to learn it. They made mistakes. Their commanders sometimes failed them. The system that sent them into battle was imperfect and sometimes careless with their lives. And still, they fought. They adapted. They held. They deserve to be remembered, not as symbols, not as props for national mythology, but as what they actually were. Young people, doing an extraordinarily hard thing, far from home, in the dark. If this story matters to you, subscribe to this channel. New videos every day documenting the wars that shaped our world.